Analysts say relations between China and the U.S. have hit their lowest point in decades. China ordered the U.S. to close its consulate in Chengdu Friday. It was in response to the Trump administration's order for Beijing to close its Houston consulate after Washington accused Chinese agents of trying to steal medical research. In addition, 4 Chinese scientists have been arrested in the U.S. and charged with visa fraud. For more on this, I want to bring in Isaac Stonefish. He's a CBSN contributor and senior fellow at the Asia Society Center on U.S. China Relations. Isaac, how significant is this escalation?
These are very significant symbolic moves because it's a concrete way for the two sides to start shutting down points of contact between each other. The issues going on in Houston or in Chengdu are less significant on their face, and more it's a way for both Trump and Xi Jinping to say, hey, I don't like what you're doing, I'm pulling back, I'm retracting the relationship, and we're not moving forwards, we're moving backwards.
So who do you believe is the architect behind this policy? Is it President Trump or is it Beijing?
I think both sides are responsible for escalating tensions. I do hope that I'd actually feel better about it if we were more the architect than Beijing, because this is such a hugely significant change in the relationship. And we need to be doing this in a very, very concrete way, and in a way that people really understand that there's some thoughtful policy behind this as opposed to just tit for tat.
So, in other words, how involved would you like to see President Trump be in the shaping of the U.S. stance against China?
I would like to see people in the U.S. administration very involved in the shaping of the U.S. stance. I think we've seen more thoughtful responses from people like Pompeo, and actually a lot of the Republican and Democratic senators have come up with really strong and really thoughtful policies about this. This is not really Trump's area. He's trying to make it his area. It's a huge campaign issue, but I think there are people in the administration who have more responsible thinking on this that they're trying to implement.
Can you break down for people that might not be aware what exactly happened with the Chinese consulate being closed in Houston and who was behind that decision and what happened exactly?
So we're not sure exactly who decided. It seems like it was probably Pompeo, but the idea was that Beijing was using Houston for something called influence operations, which is a subtle form of Chinese Communist Party statecraft, which attempts to strengthen the friends of the party and weaken the party's enemies. And as far as we can tell, the piece of visa fraud involved was a piece of that. The 4 Chinese scientists who were accused of visa fraud. The idea is that they didn't admit that they were members of the People's Liberation Army. And the way that China does these influence operations is it is often not at all transparent about what the goals of Chinese scientists or Chinese students or Chinese business people are in the United States.
Okay. So we know this week that the U.S. charged those 4 Chinese scientists with visa fraud. Do moves like this put American citizens working in China at risk?
Beijing excels at this sort of asymmetrical warfare, we could call it, where they will increasingly target Americans, but it will almost certainly be in different areas doing different things. So if I were an American business in China, if I were Disney, if I were Apple, if I were Tesla, I would be very worried that suddenly I was going to be levied with a huge tax bill, or I was going to find that one of my employees is accused of espionage. And what Beijing does is it strikes back in a way that allows for plausible deniability. So we saw some reciprocity with the consulate, but I think in terms of the way they're going to target Americans, it's much more likely to be Americans who aren't soldiers, who aren't scientists, but are business people, journalists, nonprofit workers. So Beijing can just say, oh, these people weren't following Chinese law, and this has nothing to do with the tensions, which, by the way, is America's fault.
So let's talk about next steps. What does de-escalation look like for either country at this point?
That's a really good and important question, and it looks very unlikely. I'll tell you that much. I think if Trump and Xi decide that it's better for their own domestic interests to, say, meet and talk or do trust building measures, or one side to make a symbolic gesture that they're stepping aside first. The other side could reciprocate with another gesture that allows them to walk back. But really, from where we are right now, it feels a lot more likely that things are going to go in a more heated direction as opposed to a cooler direction, especially because Trump really seems to feel that being tough on China and being tough on the Chinese Communist Party is a very successful election strategy for him on the road to November.
Isaac Stonefish, thank you for your analysis.